Again, thank you for having us in this meeting. My paper focuses, as our colleague just mentioned, on a Portuguese 18th, 19th century botanist, the Abbé Correia da Serra, and is an example of Insight's commitment to look at science diplomacy in the longue durée perspective. I've been studying the Abbé Correia da Serra together with two other colleagues for a long time now, actually about 20 years. First with a short biography within a European project, later on with a long and detailed scientific biography, and more recently, we revisited our work on Correia da Serra from the perspective of his diplomatic activity, trying to seize the entanglements between his scientific persona and his diplomatic persona. When I mentioned early before lunch that sometimes it is mostly to change our focus of analysis, actually I spoke from experience. This new approach to the Abbé Correia da Serra is framed precisely by Insight, as Pascal already presented during the morning session, and this is Correia da Serra portrayed as a young scientist on your left and in a more mature phase of his life on your right. For political and religious reasons, Correia da Serra had to flee from Portugal several times, and in fact he spent more time outside the country than in Portugal. He had to move frequently, never being able to build his own circle of students or young scientists in a stable location, but actually he played a decisive role as a kind of facilitator, encouraging and supporting transnational networks of scientists, both young and well-established scholars. Correia da Serra was what we call in Portuguese history estrangeirado, that is a European-oriented intellectual, and this group of estrangeirados are very influential in Portuguese cultural, scientific and technological panorama of the 18th century. And you can see the travels by Correia da Serra, places and dates in this small table. I have highlighted in green the period in which Correia da Serra participated as a founding member of the Lisbon Academy of Sciences, and in blue his career as a diplomat. So the Lisbon Academy of Sciences was founded in 1779 under the reign of Queen Mary I, and she was the daughter of our enlightened Portuguese King Joseph I, who is better known perhaps by the action of his prime minister, the Marquis of Pombal, who led the rebuilding of Lisbon after the earthquake in 1755 and the tsunami. We can say that the Academy of Sciences was founded around the three pairs of people with different motivations and agenda. So we have in green the Duque de Lafões and Correia da Serra. They were both European-oriented intellectuals, and I will get back to them in a minute. Then in yellow, we have Dominique Vandelli, an Italian that was called to Portugal to teach at the University of Coimbra, and the Marquis of Barbacena, who were disappointed with the almost failure of the reform of the University of Coimbra by the Marquis of Pombal. And then in blue, we have Tudor de Almeida and the Oratorians. He was a member also of the Order of the Oratory of St. Felipe Neri, who were interested in putting an end to the Jesuit monopoly concerning teaching in Portugal. For Correia da Serra and Lafões, the Academy was a tool to introduce deep changes in the science and production of scientific knowledge in Portugal, inspired by the scientific revolution of the previous centuries. It was the combined efforts of the Duque de Lafões' political influence. He was quite close to the Queen, and Correia da Serra scientific project that led to the foundation of the Academy. The Academy was a fundamental step towards the institutionalization of science in Portugal and became actually a cornerstone in the strategy of modernization of the country in a way quite close to what Professor Alberto Quadrio Curcio mentioned in his welcome address, that is, the use of sciences as a motor for progress. Serra's scientific project was, of course, centered on the concept of utilitarian science, which meant for him that it would be impossible to efficiently govern a country without knowledge of its, and I quote, natural character, that is, its resources. In his preface to the economic memoirs of the Academy, Correia da Serra emphasizes the Academy's role in spreading the lights and the contribution of sciences to the development and prosperity in Portugal. For Correia da Serra, the Academy was also part of his networking project, largely based on his political and ideological liaisons with the Freemasonry, which allowed him to establish very strong links, mainly with the Anglo-Saxon world and particularly with Great Britain and the United States of America. So the modernizing agenda was translated into utilitarian science, the idea of political complicities with Freemasonry, and then the scientific network was closely related to his American connection. In his turbulent life, Correia da Serra played diplomatic roles twice. The first in England as advisor to the diplomatic legation and business agent in Portugal in London during just 1 year, 1801, just before having to escape again, in this case, to Paris. The second time was in the United States between 1816, he arrived 4 years later, before, in 1812, and 1820, as plenipotentiary minister of the United Kingdom of Portugal, Brazil, and the Algarves, that is for short, the first ambassador of Portugal in the United States. So far, in the Portuguese historiography, the connections between science and diplomacy in the life of Correia da Serra have been analyzed independently, either focusing on the naturalist to perform the occasionally diplomatic duties, or alternatives on the diplomat who dedicated himself to botanizing in his leisure times. This dichotomy is, however, too simplistic. Clearly, the relations between science and diplomacy occurred at different levels and were at the core of the Abbé's career, both as a scientist and a diplomat. Although there are few details on the scientific activities by Correia da Serra while at his diplomatic post in England during this year, one knows that he entertained informally functions close to scientific and technical espionage, especially in the beginning of the British stay. At the request of the Portuguese Secretary of State of Naval Affairs, also a diplomat and also a naturalist, Correia da Serra sent to Portugal dry and live vegetable specimens, books, diverse material, including catalogues and instruments, maps of the defense plans of the ports of British Isles, hydrographical charts, discussed medical and public health, and refers to the first vaccines. Certainly, the Abbé's credibility as ambassador in the United States of America after he flew from France was largely built upon his scientific credibility, based on his role at the Lisbon Academy of Sciences and deepened in England and in France. He was acknowledged as a leading European naturalist, expert in botany and geology, versed in subjects ranging from theology to political economy, recognized as a brilliant communicator, educator, and promoter of junior scientists. Together with his membership of Freemasonry, the transfer of authority and prestige from science to diplomacy gave him quick access to the intellectual and political circles in the new country, and in this way he performed functions sharing characteristics of what is now called science diplomacy. Sorry. Okay, it's not working that way. So Correia da Serra arrived at the United States in 1812 at the age of 60. He was attracted by the liberal ideals of the young republic, consonant with his own political inclinations. He brought with him letters of recommendation from writers, diplomats, and also scientists. While he waited to receive from the King of Portugal the news of a diplomatic post, which took 4 years to arrive, in fact, he enrolled in the cultural and scientific life of Philadelphia. He became a member of the American Philosophical Society, presided by Caspar Wistar, and of the informal Wistar Party, a restricted circle of intellectuals who met weekly. And he also participated at the Academy of Natural Sciences of Philadelphia. By 1815, he was delivering lectures and teaching courses at both academies, and was probably the first to introduce the system of jus in the United States. He also advised on the reorganization of the University of Pennsylvania, suggesting the creation of a faculty of physical sciences and rural economy in clear consonance with his utilitarian views of science. He also became acquainted with local naturalists, intellectuals, and editors of literary magazines and journals, including the American Review of History and Politics, in which the Abbé published a long article on considerations on the state of Europe. In 1813, he visited President Madison in Washington and met for the first time with Jefferson in Monticello, in Virginia. This meeting marked the beginning of a long-lasting friendship, and he became such a regular visitor in Monticello that one of the guest rooms that we see on your right is still called today the Abbé's room. Jeffert confined to Mr. that Correia da Serra was, and I quote, the best digest of science in books, men and things that I ever met with, and with this the most amiable and engaging character. They discussed regularly scientific and political matters of common interest. No wonder that Correia da Serra was involved in the educational program of Jefferson, materialized, among others, in the creation of the University of Virginia. He not only advised on the definition of curricula, but also on the criteria for hiring teachers, which presupposed, in his view, the admission of foreign teachers, mostly European, in order to circumvent New England's parochialism. Despite advanced age and chronic health problems, Correia da Serra traveled extensively throughout the United States. He was soon one of the best connoisseurs of the country's natural landscapes, different climates, flora and geological characteristics, as well as population and their habits. He visited, as you can see here, New England, Pennsylvania, Virginia, Ohio, Kentucky, Tennessee, Georgia, North and South Carolina, and the Cherokee lands, usually traveling with friends. He also took advantage of these trips to make new acquaintances. These were all occasions to train a generation of naturalists and contribute to professionalization of an emerging scientific community in the United States. Correia da Serra promoted an utilitarian view of science, as well as I have already mentioned, anchored on the inventory and study of natural resources. He had done exactly the same claim for the Portuguese Academy of Sciences, with a view to their economic use and the consolidation of the political independence, in this case, of the United States. In this context, he wrote to President Madison about the exploitation of mineral resources, such as iron, copper, salt, silver, and insisted that the revenue should be taken from public lands. He also began an exchange with Jefferson and others on the characteristics and cultivation of various plant species of economic interest, such as, for instance, chestnut trees, coffee and sugar cane, or the use of pozzolana as cement in the construction of aqueducts. The detailed knowledge of the extensive North American territory was recorded in a single article that you can see on your left, that describes the formation and nature of the soil of Kentucky and was published in Transaction of the American Philosophical Society. In 1860, Correia da Serra was finally appointed as ambassador in Washington, a gesture that Correia da Serra summarized with characteristic wit. It was somewhat like the persimmon fruit, comes late and has been ripened by hard frosts. For long recognized by the American elite as a liberal and exceptional naturalist at the same time, who shared the ideals of the so-called philosophers' presidents, Correia da Serra confided to President Madison that as a new ambassador, he found himself in a very unusual position. His strong attachment to the young nation made him feel as, and I quote, the family minister, and John Quincy Adams, at the time the Secretary of State and later also President, and who had a great appreciation for Correia da Serra, note that his diplomatic ability was based on what he dubbed as teacup diplomacy, anchored on intellectual, scientific, political discussions, but still friendly debates over a cup of tea, particularly attractive precisely for this kind of philosopher presidents. Jefferson, of course, rejoiced with the nomination of Correia da Serra for ambassador, for he wished Correia da Serra to definitely settle in the United States. The diplomatic situation of the American continent proved to be very difficult, especially due to the support of some North Americans installed in South America to anti-colonial and, by extension, anti-Portuguese movements. There were constant acts of piracy against the Portuguese fleet by ships from the Spanish colonies, often operated by Americans, with the complacency of local authorities. The situation in Brazil, then still a Portuguese colony, though not for long, was also politically unstable and was intensified by the declaration of the independence of Pernambuco, a region in Brazil, which forced Correia da Serra to file various protests to the Secretary of State, James Monroe. This action led to the approval by the Congress of the so-called neutrality law in 1817, and this law became a central piece of the Monroe Doctrine, which advocates the non-interventionism and the isolationism of the United States in matters of international politics, and which is still today a strong trend in American foreign policy. Although Monroe, in the capacity of President of the United States, often reminded the Secretary, Quincy Adams, of the importance of Correia da Serra as a diplomat, a scientist, and a cultural man, the fact is that he not always done justice to the protests of the Portuguese diplomat. And as stated before, the Abbé's diplomatic ability consisted principally in affecting to be anything but a diplomat, impersonating the role of a friend and a fellow scientist who dropped very occasionally for just a cup of tea. In the end, the Portuguese ambassador felt increasingly powerless and disillusioned by American politics and politicians. The expectation nurtured as an American nation built on egalitarian ideas of the Enlightenment gave way to skepticism, and Correia da Serra became progressively more conservative. In 1820, he planned to move to Brazil and hoped to play a decisive role in the definition of public instruction, and mostly in this project of an American hemisphere autonomous vis-à-vis Europe. This idea was to build a new international political order based on the division of the American continent between the United States in the northern hemisphere and Portugal in the southern hemisphere. Since the end of the 18th century, part of the Portuguese intelligentsia advocated the idea of a Brazilian Portugal as an extra way of neutralizing local Brazilian nationalism. After the transfer of the capital of Portugal from Lisbon to Rio de Janeiro, following the Napoleonic invasions at the beginning of the 19th century, this project gained momentum, and Correia da Serra was one of its advocates. Named by his American friends as our Socrates, or as the Franklin of Europe, Correia da Serra shared with Jefferson similar views on politics, diplomacy, and history, based on the structural and integrative function of sciences. His diplomatic practice and historical reflections on the past and future of Europe made him particularly attuned to the Jeffersonian geopolitical project. And to sum up, the success of Correia da Serra diplomatic activity, stricto sensu, resulting mostly from the capital accumulated as a scientist, Masonic polymath. Let us add that in his capacity as ambassador, he also carried out research in Philadelphia and in the main ports of the American Northeast, whose results were included in reports containing economic and politically relevant information for commercial trade between the Portuguese government and the United States. These reports did not deserve the attention of the Portuguese government, but nevertheless, they were relevant concerning the diplomatic activity of Correia da Serra. Taken together, all these activities dealt with matters close to what we now understand by science diplomacy, particularly in the sense of science for diplomacy. He did so through field trips, education of young scientists, advice on university organizations, discussion on the scientific agenda of the new country. He did it so too as part of the so-called teacup diplomacy, an informal science diplomacy that allows us to dig in the roots of nowadays concept of science diplomacy. Thank you.